Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us at this new book event. My name is Sean. I'm the Director of Policy at the Center for Energy Ethics, and today we'll be discussing the book No More Fossils by Dominic Boyer, published by University of Minnesota Press. Dominic, if you don't already know him, is a professor of anthropology at Rice University, whose work examines energy, climate, politics, and society. He's the author of numerous books and media, and these media include the Culture of Energy's podcast, which if you don't listen to, I do highly recommend. We're going to start by turning it over to Dominic and then kick off our discussion. So without any further ado, we'll hand it over to Dominic. Dominic, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you all for joining. And I love it that we're doing something that's hybrid and we have, thank you, very kind, that we're doing something that has the ability to connect all of us in many different parts of the world today. I'm really thrilled. As I was telling Sean before we got into this part of the presentation, I think the Center for Energy Ethics is really one of the most amazing energy humanities institutes anywhere in the world, doing great work not only at home in Scotland, but helping to create connections and a sense of community for us scattered across the world. And so I can't think of another group of people I'd rather talk to about this particular book project than y'all. So let me go ahead and share my screen. I've got, let's see here, hold on. I've got a few slides to show. I'll try not to go on and on because I know some of you have probably already had a chance to look at the book, and so hearing me rehearse it may not be as thrilling, but I also suspect there might be some people here who are just sort of curious about what the book might contain, and so I do want to spend a little time giving you some insights into that project. So in terms of backstory, why this book? It's a short book. It's a book that I tried to write with a broader audience in mind, in part to try to translate some of the work I've been doing on energy politics, or as I prefer to call them, energopolitics, for a wider audience. So that's part of the mission here. Also, I just had a curiosity, long-standing about fossil, the idea, the concept of fossil within fossil fuels. I feel as though in the energy humanities, we've spent a lot of time talking about the fuel aspect of fossil fuels, and thinking of Karen Pincus's remarkable speculative dictionary as one of many examples there, but less time maybe spent thinking about fossil and what that means and why, what we could use through a fossil analytic to understand about our contemporary predicament. I think many of us probably feel as though we're trapped somehow in a fossil gerontocracy, of fossil fuels, and that's the part of the subject of this book, how we came to be sort of captured by this modern energy system, and then what we might do as ways of moving beyond it. So the first part of the book is an effort to give a somewhat more nuanced genealogy of the evolution of the modern energy system. And as much as any one image could, I think this flow-through chart from the Lawrence Livermore National Lab, which tries to, again, in one complex chart, visualize U.S. energy production and consumption, and it does this for other countries and too, but in the United States being, one of the greatest offenders when it comes to carbon emissions, I think we deserve the spotlight on this. This graphic, I think, tells us a couple of things that are important to reflect on. First, if you look at the production inputs on the left side of the diagram, you can see that despite the significant inroads that are being made in renewable energy in many parts of the world, even in Texas, where the entire interconnection queue for our electricity provider is now solar and storage and wind projects. There's almost no natural gas even. So the feeling of something on the cusp of change is here, really. But then if you look at the inputs on the left side of this diagram, you see that over 3/4 of the United States energy system still depends fundamentally upon fossil fuels. And that's something that has to be reckoned with when we think about the depth and tenacity of petroculture today. Look on the right side of the diagram and you see something that maybe is less well known but makes perfect sense, is that it's an incredibly inefficient and wasteful energy system. Fully 2/3 of the energy that goes into, that's burned, let's say, in the name of producing what are here euphemistically called energy services becomes rejected energy. You're rejected. This energy is rejected, meaning that's lost in heat loss from chemical to mechanical energy conversions, line loss and grids. All sorts of things mean that this energy that we use sort of really it moves according to an ethics that I think David Hughes has captured very well as energy without conscience of the loss and the waste that's involved in it. And in the transportation sector, I don't know if you can see lower right quadrant, you can see that fully 80% of the energy put in is lost. So this is where the sort of the efficiency gains of electric vehicles become a talking point. Anyway, that's where we are. How did we get where we are? And I start the story not with petropolitics, which I think are incredibly important, but with what I call sucropolitics, the energy politics that developed around European plantations, colonial plantations. And there's a few reasons for that. You probably are aware of Sid Mintz's landmark work, Sweetness and Power, that tells a wonderful story about the entanglement of sugar, specifically with the rise of modern transatlantic capitalism. And there's been a lot of scholarship in the past couple of decades, both on the early evolution of transatlantic capitalism and on the plantation as a distinctive social and political space that not only reinforces, I think, Mintz's central argument, but really goes beyond it to show just how significant sugar was as a catalytic force in the making of European modernity. And that, I mean, just to put it in very blunt terms, obviously the Europeans wanted all sorts of things from the rest of the world. They wanted land to claim for their sovereigns. They wanted people to work for them for free. They wanted precious metals that they saw as containing intrinsic value. But if you look practically speaking at how European colonization unfolded, it unfolded through the founding of a series of sugar plantations beginning in the Western Mediterranean in the early part of the 15th century in the Madeiras and spreading outward to the Canary Islands, then down the west coast of Africa as far as Sao Tome, where by 1500 we had something that looks very, very much like the prototype of the plantation forms that would spread later across Brazil and the Caribbean, forms that involved a large standing reserve of labor, both human and animal labor, as well as an enslaved laboring population as the primary engine of production. And Christopher Columbus, again, not well known, but was a son-in-law of a wealthy Madeiran sugar grower. When he goes on his second voyage to the New World, he's bringing along plantings of sugarcane with him. He's looking for places to establish plantations. And that only tells part of the story, sort of sugar as being this incredibly valuable commodity at the time, with, much like oil today, a seemingly inexhaustible demand for it. So it was a way to create enormous wealth. There were risks, of course, but the wealth seems to have won the day. And in addition to that, sugar's relationship to the development of the distinctive forms and practices of modern capitalism really has a lot to do with the amount of force that was involved in getting the sweet, juicy, pulpy core of sugarcane away from the wooden husk. So more so than with any of the other plantation commodities, cotton, tobacco, indigo, to get sugar out of sugarcane required an immense amount of force, which is why so much human and animal labor had to be organized. And beyond just the sheer sort of degree of force that was required, also there was a temporal dimension to this too, because it soured very quickly. So not only did you have to harvest the sugarcane quickly, you had to process it and distill it very quickly, lest your precious commodity be destroyed. So this is part of why the intensification of labor, the militarization of labor, the extractivist enterprise sort of becomes sharpened through the sugarcane plantation is for this reason. And I talk in the book even as though because that standing reserve of labor had to be kept busy outside the planting season too, in a way, there's a way in which the colonial plantation also gives birth to the bullshit job, as my dearly departed friend David Graeber once described it. So there's a lot happening in this material, energomaterial nexus of sugarcane that is important. And in addition to that, dimension, which also necessitates industrial inventions, the pioneering use of steam engines, and in many ways, the sort of the first flourishings of industrial revolution. The story we tend to hear about how the Industrial Revolution took shape, well, it's a story in which Scotland, as a matter of fact, plays a very sort of central role. And we hear about how James Watt, created the modern steam engine and commercialized it, and thus the Industrial Revolution sort of flowed. But if you think about where the necessity for creating mechanical supplements to human labor is coming from, it's actually happening in the colonies. So a decade before James Watt has a functional steam engine, there are already steam engines in places like Jamaica that are taking over from the human and more often animal labor of the sugar plantation. So the the New World becomes a kind of center of technological innovation that then flows back into Europe. And this is something that actually happens especially in sort of agri-tech all through the end of the 19th century. At the same time, the sugar wealth has a world-shaping effect back in Europe too. Mintz talks about how it's had an enormous impact upon the diet and even the working class culture of Europe over time, as it became to be seen to be a dietary necessity rather than as a supplement or a spice. But also think about the immense amount of wealth that's being generated in the New World and that's flowing back to the benefit of Europe's merchant and commercial classes, giving them increasing economic and political leverage in their struggle, famously documented against aristocratic institutions and networks. And so the class ideology of the European middle classes, as it's come to be known as political liberalism, it emphasizes many of the traits that one finds already being formed on the ground in the plantation culture. The idea that endless work, is actually now a form of virtue, and that the New World itself is a terra nullius, a nullius of such abundance that it can permit endless growth of plunder and private property development by those deemed industrious and rational. And I have a nod here to John Locke, who, although writing maybe 150 years into the development of this plantation culture, in many ways provides the retroactive alibi for why it all happened in the first place. In other words, that God bequeathed all the resources and lands of the world to humanity to develop them according to his capital H will. But of course, we find that some humans didn't develop the resources properly, meaning that other humans, Europeans, could step in then to rightfully take this wasteland, as it was conceptualized at the time, and develop it on behalf of the indigenous peoples of the world. And this becomes, of course, the pretext for all kinds of settler colonial plunder. Again, but the point is, he sort of follows on the end wave of what you might call the sucroliberalism, even though looking back, we think of him as being a sort of founder of something. He in some ways also is the kind of owl of Minerva in a certain sense at the end of this phase of development. In any case, as Catherine Youssef has put it, in the colonization of the New Worlds, Europeans organized human properties, extractable energy properties, and that's certainly true. But this system, the plantation system, is not the only aspect of the modern energy regime. And I want to just emphasize that it's not as though these completely displace each other. I think they stack upon one another. So I think sucropolitics still lives with us today, but it's also displaced from the dominant energy regime by an increasingly effective wave of rebellions of plantation slave labor across the Caribbean, across the course of the 18th century, culminating in the Haitian Revolution, which is the one revolution that's very rarely taught, for example, in American high schools, but probably is the most consequential revolution of them all in terms of how it reshaped geopolitics in its aftermath. And Saint-Domingue, which was the colony that preceded Haiti, was the wealthiest colony by far, the most successful of the plantation colonies. It was at one point exporting 75% of all the sugar consumed in Europe and 60% of all the coffee on this one island. And it was also the largest slave population, the most disciplined and violently repressed slave population, and the slaves organized in ways that aren't even fully understood to overthrow that plantation system, thus casting into chaos many of the political expectations of the time. And this gave rise, I think, to, not in a simple causal way, but in the complex way that histories often unfold, to the opportunity for this more mechanized dimension of the plantation scene, this sort of mechanical invention culture, to become a more significant part of modern energy moving forward. And so I argue that this coal, steam, steel nexus that evolved then over the course of the 19th century really then becomes the most important force in terms of formalizing European standards of modernity, domesticity, economy. Carbopolitics, as I call it, centers on this immense application of mechanical energy to create commodities cheaply, quickly, reliably. And as Kara Daggett has told us in her brilliant book, The Birth of Energy, it also led to a rethinking or reimagination, culturally speaking, of what energy was. Now, energy is work, is modeled upon mechanical work in a world that, again, is defined by a weird witch's brew of Scottish Presbyterianism and thermodynamic science, is a world in which energy struggles against entropy. So the energy of progress struggles against chaos and decay, which, of course, is a great, again, another great motivating metaphor for European empire to sort of go forth and colonize and improve and bring progress to the world. We see that, of course, in the 19th century. But we also see what Ian Barber has called a democracy of things that I think has really been, again, a profoundly impactful in terms of our lives in the 21st century. This immense productivity of machine labor and its ability to create all sorts of useful commodities. Even Karl Marx never doubted that capitalism was the world's best system for producing useful things. He just saw that capitalism couldn't care less about producing useful things. It wanted to produce profits, right? So that split really comes into its own through carbopolitics. There are new standards of necessity and luxury, and along with the fact that things that were very rare in the early 19th century become seen to be absolute essentials of living a modern life and a prosperous life by the middle to late 19th century. The reorganization of the energy system around coal also gives capital new political leverage over labor. This is something that Karl Marx is told, I think, was in a sense a contemporary witness to, but Andreas Malm gives us a wonderful study of how this drives industrial production, urbanization, again, the Scottish clearances, clearly a part of this whole story. And alongside this, the other Marx, the less known Marx, Leo Marx, a wonderful historian of technology, talks about how the carbopolitical era really initiated a transportation revolution, one that petropolitics will build upon later. But in a sense, most of, including automobility, locomotion, most of these technologies are really carbopolitical in expressing this sort of sense of machinic freedom and machinic power, so that humanity then, with these machinic prosthetics, becomes a kind of divine or seen to be having attained nearly divine powers of technology. So I think the technological fetish that we live with today is carbopolitical too. This idea that technology proxies our power in the world, that the better technology wins, that the better technology is progressive. All of these things that I think we continue to live with have their sort of origin points in the 19th century carbopolitics too. Petropolitics, I think we know better. I won't say as much about it other than to say I'm building here upon stories that have been told already by Timothy Mitchell. His amazing story of how carbon democracy leads, in some ways, the materiality of coal, the organization of its production leads to certain kinds of democratic potentials that are then overcome in a mid-20th century switch from coal to petroleum as the basis of the modern energy system. Stephanie Lemenager has done an amazing job of explaining how oil and oily thinking and logics permeate culture in various ways. But something that Lemenager draws attention to that I think actually should be a more important part of Mitchell's story too, with due appreciation to an amazing work. I think that, looking at it historically, it really is the combination of the oil booms of the early part of the 20th century, particularly the Texan oil boom, and automobility. That is the sympoetic, to use a term that Donna Haraway likes, the sympoiesis that actually becomes the catalyst for the rise of the American model of petrocultural sprawl. And around the turn of the 20th century, there were steam-powered automobiles, there were electric automobiles, there were even hydrogen prototype automobiles. But it's the combination of the cheapness suddenly of fossil fuels and oil, as well as the combination with the industrial innovations of a Henry Ford, let's say, that allows the car to become this, again, part of the democracy of things, and indeed like a sort of leading representative of that democracy. And with the end of the Second World War, and I think here Mitchell is entirely right, that model begins to globalize. We get the petronologies that he talks about, the Keynesianism that sort of expects growth to be the sine qua non of something called the economy that can endlessly grow. And can be nurtured, and that you also have through petroleum's derivative plastics, and this is a story that scholars like Heather Davis have told so well, that they become essential material forms across the planet. So I think automobility, plasticity, expansiveness become the sort of distinguishing hallmarks of petroculture in many ways. And so the world enters, but unevenly, into this time of global petroculture. I'm sorry, I'm getting some weird light effects here as the sun moves around. So here we are, and this is the world, of course, we all know. Life worlds defined through mobility, consumerism, cheap goods, rampant energy use without regard for environmental impacts. And of course, as I mentioned at the beginning, petroculture continues to expand today despite widening recognition of its ecocidal consequences. So this is kind of the genealogical part of the story. People wonder what comes next. I speculate that probably electroculture is what's coming next. If you were to look at many of the energy transition infrastructures and narratives today, mostly they center upon an expansion of electricity to the dominant apparatus of modern energy. But there are alternative possibilities we could talk about too, if you're interested. The real question is, does this electroculture sort of stay within the grooves already laid by petrocultures, or is it possible that electricity could enable some new possibilities, potentials in terms of, let's say, energy democracy, energy citizenship, energy justice? I think looking at the historical record, and again, the way in which each of these energy regimes has absorbed the others, preceding ones, and built upon them in new directions, I think that inheritance is assured to some extent. We will be inheriting an electrified version of petroculture to some extent, at least in its early phases, but change is quite possible and should be expected. And so there's a real reason why we would be militating today to fight for a better electroculture as we sort of navigate ourselves through the complexities of this transition. So the second part of the book, and I'll go through these other parts a bit faster in view of time. The second part is called Fossil Gerontocracy: What Sticks Us Where We Are. And this image you see is of a wind-up tank is really telling. This issue of Forbes is the one where the term petrostate was coined, and the petrostate is, and almost again without any recognition that this was a neologism, just it kind of mentions it for the first time. I had a couple of research librarians work on trying to find the first instance of the use of petrostate, and this is what we came up with. But this is, in fact, I think quite telling of the story I want to tell, the relationship of the fossil gerontocracy to military power. And I try to triangulate thinking about where we are today in our moment of feeling like we're living in an exhausted system that isn't kind of aware of its own precarity and fragility and of the need for its end, with both the circumstances surrounding the coining of the term gerontocracy. So James Fawzy, who coined this term, coined it with respect to a critique not of just it sounds a little bit like ageism when you first read his work, but what he's really talking about is the idea that a single generation can have a perpetual monopolistic rule over all of society. So he's talking about the problem of the generation of 1789, which he says, what genius for domination agitated this turbulent generation? She began by suppressing her fathers. She ends by disinheriting her children. I think we could say the same thing about the 68ers today, right? The boomer generation, who seem to be very much in a similar situation. And yet, what I want to argue is not that gerontocracy is really a problem of aging humans fundamentally, because there are boomers who do get it, right? We know that. But really, it's a problem of the ongoing fossilization of this infrastructure, and indeed of the fact that we need more pluralization of generational control in our politics. Let's put it that way. So with using a kind of elaborate metaphor of quicksand that I try to sort of use to think about how we're stuck in the mud of this moment, but wanting to differentiate some different kinds of sedimentary layers of this muck or this ooze. I talk in this section of the book about the petrostate. And what I mean by petrostate is not just countries that earn a lot of money from oil revenues, which is typically how they're discussed. There's a whole, kind of academic literature on the curse of the petrostate, and that, we could get into if you're interested. But I actually think what we should be thinking about with petrostates is not a specific condition of certain countries, and then argue about whether 40% of your economy coming from oil revenues makes you a petrostate, or whether it's only 10%. But rather, I think we should think of the petrostate as a general condition that afflicts all government today through this, again, symbiotic tangle of oil and political military power. That means that even a state like Iceland, which is a place I've spent quite a lot of time in recent years, that in many ways you could argue has been able to disentangle itself from petropolitics, it would seemingly have been able to do through its massive, renewably powered electricity and heating systems, is also still, part of this fossilized infrastructural ecology through automobility, through aviation, through the fact that, warships, even though that doesn't have its own navy, other warships may visit that need oil. And so even countries that seem to have the capacities to break free are in a way sucked back into this petrostate complex, which involves a great many different elements and actors, which again, we can talk about later if you're interested. The second layer, which is perhaps less sticky, but equally, I think, consequential in many ways, is what I call petrohabits or petrohabitus, with a nod to Bourdieu. Not only individual habits, which is, again, a kind of neoliberal carbon accounting logic that I don't particularly support, although I understand and empathize with individuals trying to make better decisions in their individual family lives, perhaps. But in fact, it really should be seen as a reproduction of social power, a feel for the game, as Bourdieu might have it, for petroculture, within the context of what Andre Gortz calls the poverty of affluence engendered by the treadmill effect of petropolitical class hierarchy and conflict. And I don't want to go too down a Gortzian rabbit hole here, other than to say I found him enormously helpful for thinking about class power and petropower together. And essentially, the argument is that you'll never be able to reach anything like a equitable distribution of goods in a fossil fuel capitalist system because of its constant necessary use of innovation to create differentiators between different class groups, so that you always have Tesla batteries being put forward as the response to climate change, even though Tesla batteries can only be afforded by a small segment of the population. If eventually a Tesla battery becomes something that is a mass consumer artifact, there will have to be, I don't know, an electric helicopter that's available to the uber elites to continue to differentiate them. And that treadmill effect, which he calls the poverty of affluence, is something that it's hard to unentangle ourselves from. It's part of why Gortz himself favored a sort of post-petro-socialism. And finally, petro knowledge. We know we're in it deep all the time. And I just talk a little bit in this section about how we have, in a sense, different variants of petro knowledge that are circulating. Some are more obviously celebratory of petropower's continued relevance and influence and the necessity, this idea that we can't possibly imagine a world without oil. Again, similar to the life of at the end of state socialism in Eastern Europe, which is my other gerontocratic analogy I talk a little bit about here. Couldn't imagine the end of socialism until it ended, and then everyone said, well, of course it had to end. It couldn't have survived in this world. I think we're in a similar situation with petroculture. I say, yet when the oil economy finally collapses, as with the end of Soviet socialism, I suspect the majority of us will simply shrug at how obvious it was that petroculture could never last. That may be true, but in the world of petroknowledge we inhabit now, there's a lot of swirly, sly, surreal misdirection that's happening. And I try to give some examples of how oily knowledge today is not just championing oil directly, but finds a variety of ways to make itself seem essential to a future. But by doing so, it has to increasingly sort of cut off its relationship to the world, because of course the data of the world are saying something very different than what petro-knowledge wants to tell us. So I can't prove this, it's just a hunch, but I think if somebody were to do a really deep genealogy of post-truth as a problem, a phenomenon, at least in its contemporary version, I think you could find all kinds of links to these fossil fuel petro-epistemic disruptions, to, I think, something along the lines of what Naomi Oreskes has done in her work is sort of an example of that. But I think there's probably more research to be done, more to be said about this post-truth dimension of petro-knowledge. So finally, third part of the book, and I'll say probably the least about this, other than to say this is probably what we'll talk more about in the Q&A. I imagine that's usually how it goes. What is to be done? So okay, you've given us the genealogy of how we got here. You've talked a little bit about some of what sticks us in our place, and now what is to be done. The images here are from one thing that I'm doing, a humble project to create a series of rain gardens in Houston as an alternative to high energy conventional concrete and steel flood control assemblages. A humbler use of natural, I use that obviously guardedly, the term natural here, but of more natural ecosystemic functions and capacities to deal with some of the same problem. And that is, in a sense, I think, where my thinking about political activity today is focused. I think that I talk about two things essentially in that section. One is decompositional politics. And again, this is with a nod to the compost work, the humus being that Donna Haraway has written so powerfully about, this idea that perhaps what we need to pursue is strategies of decomposition with regard to petrostate. That I think it really is. The petrostate is really the has to be the focus here, the political focus, but also petro habits, also petro knowledge could be part of a decompositional tactics. And then in terms of, if that's an ethos that we might want to think about politically, decomposition and recomposition of the elements of those dissembled political forms into new projects, that might be part of what we then recompose as revolutionary infrastructure, which I use revolution here guardedly also, and specifically in the sense that Ariella Azoulay has laid it out, not revolution in the conventional sense of one group of elites displace another group of elites, but leave a sort of pyramid of inequality and dispossession intact, but rather revolution in her sense of the building of civil power. Civil power is an alternative to elite-led projects of social transformation. Civil power projects that can be quite humble, can be quite invisible to conventional infrastructural politics. And again, the example of the rain gardens we're working on in Houston is a kind of example of local infrastructure that can be quite meaningful and consequential, but in a sense, part of what it does is it builds civil power towards transformation in the direction, hopefully, of greater justice, equity, and democracy in the coming energy order, whatever shape that takes. And then finally, I talk a little bit about the affective dimension of this too, because I think we are disposed at this moment, those of us who know enough to know what's going on, really are lured into an emotional circuit of anxiety, fear, despair, and mania. Mania, I mean that in the sort of psychoanalytic sense of a deep overinvestment in the now, in the sort of present circumstance. And part of, I think, why I organized the book this way was to give ourselves a sense of the historical development, the historicity of our moment, as well as what's come before it, to give a sense that where we are now is not an inevitable condition. In fact, fossils form, geologically speaking, they're very precarious. It's very rare to have a fossil. Like most life forms in the world die and are not captured as fossils, but are just dissembled by their neighbors into their neighbors' life projects. And so that we're living in a world filled with fossils shouldn't frighten us, because once fossils are taken out of their environment of formation, they tend to be quite brittle. So we have a lot, perhaps more possibility than we think, as long as we understand that the kinds of changes that are happening are not going to happen, I think, at the level of the overthrow immediately of the oil majors, but rather at the chipping away and sort of decomposition of their life form, their fossilized life forms, I think, into projects that we might be able to take in other directions. And that means, I think, resisting mania. Try also to be appreciative of the time that belongs to us. It is tragic. We live in tragic times. We also live in epic times. And this is a message that I found resonates better with students than just saying, you live in a fucked up world. Try to embrace the fact that it's rare, actually quite rare, that you live in a time of transition between energy regimes, between political regimes, and these changes are coming in one way or another. They aren't necessarily going to be better, because there is the kind of Elon Musky kind of electro-fascist, electro-authoritarian version that I'm sure is one that we will have to resist directly, but that there are also other potentialities in play. And that, again, part of that is hard work. But again, trying to resist this, Lockean sucroliberal idea that the life is work and work is virtue, and the harder we work, the more virtuous we are. We also have to play. We also have to rest too, because this idea of sort of working ourselves ragged to fight against massive infrastructures is something that I think exhausts precisely the people who need to maintain some of their energy and ability to stay engaged. And it can't, it's as I say in the book, we're really not in the last chapter. We'd like to think of ourselves as being in the last chapter of a story. I think we should be thinking about ourselves as in the first chapter of a story. And that might actually give us a better appreciation for the temporality ahead, for the rhythm of transition and transformation that we're inhabiting. And so part of what the book contains, and you'll find this especially if you read the online edition, is there's a little game in there. There's a little game that actually was invented in Scotland by a few of us. We were hoping to do it for the COP meetings, but because of the pandemic, had to sort of put that idea aside. I offer the game here simply as a kind of an activity, a low carbon pleasure form that gives us something to feel good about, to feel connected to ourselves, each other, the world around us, without, again, anxiety and fear and guilt, shame being the dominant affective orientations. I don't think those orientations are going to get us where we need to go. So with all of that, I'll stop. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for those of you who've read the book, and it's available for free online at this link. So although it is a small, inexpensive book that probably won't break budgets, it's even better that it's also free, I think. So thank you to the University of Minnesota Press and the Forerunner series for seeing it that way too.